I'd really like to welcome Charlie Willliams today. My name is Margie Moeller, and I live here in Yountville, and I'm currently on the Yountville Town Council. And today is Thursday, November the 6th, 2014, and I wanted to take this opportunity to interview Charlie because he was here right at the beginning, a little bit even before Yountville was incorporated. Well, we can talk about that a little bit. And just to have him share all of his thoughts and all the facts about how Yountville really kind of became a town, and share all that with everybody else. So Charlie, maybe you could start by introducing yourself and where you were born and your family and where you went to school.
Thank you, Margie. It's a pleasure to be here. I was born in San Mateo, California, just down the peninsula from San Francisco, in November of 1930. I was raised in San Mateo, educated there, went to the University of California, received my bachelor's degree, and then entered the law school and received my Bachelor of Laws degree, or now a Juris Doctor degree, from the Bolt School of Law, which is now referred to as Berkeley Law. My early law practice was with a firm that specialized in representing small governments and doing municipal financing. So my introduction to the practice of the law was to represent small local governments with regard to financing principles. My first job as a city attorney was being assistant city attorney of the city of Benicia in 1957, 58.
So you were actually their city attorney at that time?
The city attorney was busy in Sacramento, so I was the assistant city attorney, and I did principally the work.
Okay, great.
In 1960, the city of Pleasant Hill incorporated in Contra Costa County, and I was appointed the first city attorney of that city. And I was their city attorney for some 30 years.
So how did you become associated with Yountville? And when was that?
In 1963, the firm that I was associated with had contacts in Sacramento and connections in Sacramento, and it was probably through that connection that Jack Forrester approached the firm to assist the water district in trying to negotiate for additional water and additional terms with the city of Napa. The contract between the city of Napa and Yountville provided that the city or the area of Yountville, it was then the Yountville Water District, paid about 75% above the same rates that Napa was charging their residents.
So the only water that came into Yountville, or the area of Yountville, was from Napa because the Veterans Home had rectors. Is that how it worked?
That's correct,
Okay.
yes. And that contract with Napa ran out in 1976, so here we were, that was 10 years later, 10 plus years later, and so they wanted a more permanent arrangement. So I did some work in connection with Jack Forrester and the Yountville Water District, but about the same time there was a movement for incorporation, and the whole water district negotiation got subsumed by the incorporation process.
So we were still, Yountville as we know it today, was still getting their water from the city of Napa, but the thought was certainly there to do something about a contract that was going to be running out.
Yes, that's what actually eventually happened after incorporation. But the negotiations with Napa, as I recall, never even really got started. we got so involved in the incorporation movement in 1964 that the negotiations with Napa on behalf of the water district just
got pushed aside for
Exactly.
a later time.
Yeah.
So when you were working with doing that back then, you must have come to Yountville several times. What was really going on in Yountville? What was Yountville like back in the 60s?
Well, I have several adjectives to describe what I encountered at the time. The town was physically unattractive. There was a high proportion of dilapidated buildings. The businesses were developed along a strip in 2 different locations. There were inadequate park and recreation facilities. There were an excessive number of taxi cabs, card rooms, and beer bars.
We've heard that. So you saw them yourself.
Indeed I did.
They were definitely.
And there was
there.
some evidence of public drunkenness too.
We've also heard about that as well. So it seems to be a pretty consistent theme. So was that, we've talked to Ella Gates, and she's certainly given us her impressions about that. So was that the main reason that the movement to incorporate began, or how did all that really kind of come about?
Well, in 1960, there was a Yountville Improvement Club that had been formed, and they hired an outside consultant to do an incorporation study. That is, feasibility as to whether or not the Yountville area could support a municipality if it was voted in favor of by the residents. And that study resulted in the grassroots group of public interested citizens of Yountville to initiate an incorporation movement. And they circulated a petition that resulted in a hearing before the Board of Supervisors in 1960, at which the board received any comments and public protests.
So this petition, did everybody in town have to sign it, or do you remember how that worked?
The state law required petition to be signed and approved by property owners representing 50% of the assessed valuation of the property within the area to be incorporated.
So it wasn't just the registered voters, it was really tied to property ownership?
Yes.
That's interesting.
And the area of the boundaries to be incorporated were the boundaries of the then existing county water district.
All right, so you were telling us about the Yountville Water District being the area that covered the the property parcels, is that correct? The property
Yes.
owners.
Yes.
And so was that area, it did not include the Veterans Home, but yet the Veterans Home was part of Yountville. Can you tell us about that?
That's correct. The boundaries of the water district also excluded what is now known,
The V Marketplace?
Yes.
Yes, that's what we call it now, right?
the name again?
We call it the V Marketplace.
V
It
Marketplace.
used to be
The
vintage,
Marketplace.
it used to be vintage 1870 or old
Yeah.
Grosinger's winery.
Yeah,
So it excluded that area,
it did,
okay?
yes. Now back to the incorporation movement in 1960. At the Board of, at the Board of Supervisors hearing on whether or not the petition was adequate, there were public protests that reduced the number of people wanting to incorporate less than 50% of the assessed valuation. And that resulted in an abandonment of the incorporation proceeding.
So, but do you remember how many people they had to sign? Didn't they have to sign 50% of the property owners have to sign the petition, but yet were they changing their mind and deciding to protest?
No, the the petition to incorporate, I can't recall the number of signatures that were required, but that was the first step.
I
The
see.
second step was a public hearing at which they had to show that there were 50% of the owners of 50% of the assessed valuation within the proposed city
I see.
were in favor of incorporation.
And that didn't really turn out that way then?
That's correct. At the public hearing, there was a majority protest that resulted in the abandonment of the incorporation proceedings.
And so what year was that?
1960.
That was 1960, after they had commissioned the report that said, yes, it would be a good idea. You'd probably have better streets and fire service, et cetera.
That's correct.
I've always heard that a lot of the people were afraid that their businesses would they'd be run out of their businesses, the taxi cabs, the bars, et cetera. Was that probably the reason?
Yeah, I was not privy to those proceedings in 1960.
Okay.
So I don't know what motivated the majority protest.
Okay.
But in any event, as I started to consult with the county water district, Jack Forster and the board of directors, this grassroots movements restarted. And it was motivated by, I remember the names of some of the people very well, Jack Forster, Thurman and Ella Gates, the Delinskys were among the prime movers. There were many others, of course, whose names escape me at the moment. But it was truly a really grass movement idea again to.
And they just believed in it, and they weren't going to take no for an answer.
That's correct.
Good for them.
Yeah. And so as a result, any proceedings to negotiate with the county of Napa just fell by the wayside, and we concentrated on the incorporation proceedings, getting a majority approval, and then if we did that, then conducting the election and getting people out to vote at the election.
So you had to go through the same procedure the second time with a petition to the Board of Supervisors and a public hearing, and it sounds like it was favorable the second time.
The second time it was favorable. They received an adequate petition signed by 25% of the property owners of the city, representing more than 50% of the assessed valuation. The hearing was held before the Board of Supervisors, and the board then was forced, under the proceedings by state law, to call an election within the proposed boundaries of the city.
So do you remember much about that election and the outcome and how that came about?
The election,
They had to go on a ballot. Did they call it a
Yes.
special election? For that?
yeah, in January of '65, the Board of Supervisors called the election.
So they had to work quite a number of years, 4 or 5 years, after the first failed petition before they could eventually even come to that election time.
Yes.
They were very diligent.
The election was called in January to be held in February or March? February. The election was held and it was successful, thanks to the grassroots movement by the interested citizens in the town.
So it first started, the boundaries or the property owners had to be in the Yountville Water District. So how did it come about that the Veterans Home was included within the property or the town limits?
Well, when we went to the Board of Supervisors with the proposed incorporation, we amended the boundaries by including the Veterans Home property within the proposed boundaries of this proposed city.
Because the state probably had requirements about the minimum number of people, I would imagine.
If I remember correctly then, the number of residents of the city proposed to be incorporated had to be 500 or more.
And so the people within the water district at the time, it was less than 500, so.
I believe it was, yes.
Okay, so that's how that came about. That's very interesting. Back to the water at the time. So we were then officially incorporated February 4th, 1965. So at that time, we were still, Yountville was getting its water from the city of Napa.
Yes.
And not Rector, and then that happened later.
Yes.
In the 70s, you said, wow.
After incorporation, if you want to stay with the question of water for the moment, in 1966, the city council said we've got to do something about water. And they initiated negotiations with the state of California to acquire a contract for water to be received from Rector Reservoir.
Wow, that's great.
And we had a whole series of meetings during 1966, resulting in a contract with the state for water from Rector to the town in 1967.
So that's when the first water from Rector started flowing into the town.
I don't remember exactly the physical
Okay,
arrangements,
but about then,
yes.
okay. Oh, that's very interesting. I'm sure that will be news to a lot of people who probably didn't know that history. So let's get back to incorporation. So what really needed to happen now that the vote was taken and it passed? Seems like there would be a lot to do to form a local government. What can you tell us? How did that all happen?
Well,
where did you meet? I mean, did you have to?
Arrangements were made to meet at the community hall that was owned by the church. And that became the time and place, the place for the city council
So that was
meetings.
officially town hall or city hall back then, when we
Yeah.
were called a city rather than a town.
There were 5 members of the city council elected, 3 of whom were from the Veterans Home, 2 of whom were from the incorporated area of the town of Napa. That's
Wow.
2 of Yountville.
Wow. So that's pretty interesting that the majority of the first council actually resided up here. Were they? But was the treasurer up here? Was he involved? He just helped, I think, with the incorporation. I don't know if he was. I really don't know. I'm going to look that up myself. Who were actually on the first city council? So, were there requirements from the county or the state that you had to do in those early days?
Well, yes. As a result of incorporation, the county water district and the sewer district, which was coterminous with the boundaries of the water district, were absorbed and became a part of the city. So the city inherited the water and the sewer functions that had previously been conducted by special districts.
Oh, I see. So that all had to be put in place, all that information. That must have been quite a bit. Do you remember how the first town council was elected back then? Did you have to hold an election immediately after you incorporated? Or?
Well, no, at the election for incorporation, there was the ballot measure of whether or not to incorporate as a city. Mm-hmm. And then if it incorporated as a city, to elect 5 members of the city council.
Oh, at the same time?
Yes.
So you had an instant government in place if it passed?
Correct.
That was a good
Yes.
idea. Also, can you tell us a little bit about, once you got going, I would imagine there weren't any resolutions or ordinances. How did you begin all that process, and how much time did that take to put some of the basic infrastructure in place?
When the town was initially declared to be a town, let's correct the terminology.
Okay.
City was the official state designation. So it was the city of Yountville. Subsequently, the legislature permitted cities throughout the state of California to be called a town instead of a city if they so elected to do so.
I think that happened, we did that in the 80s sometime, I don't have the exact date.
Yeah. So in any event, referring to the city, the then city, referring to it as the town, which is the way I think of it now. There were an enormous amount of steps that had to be taken once the city was incorporated. Once the city was formed, the county, there were no ordinances or regulations affecting the health and safety of the city. Nothing, because the city was a separate entity from the county. So we had to adopt by ordinance all of the same regulations that had previously prevailed in the city, all dealing with matters of health and safety and traffic regulations and so forth. One of the first steps the new council took, I think it was the very first meeting, was to declare a moratorium on new taxi cabs and new card rooms. The ordinance is saying there's a moratorium, there may not be any new taxi cabs or card rooms created.
But anybody who was in existence before that was
Yes,
still allowed to
they were
exist.
grandfathered in.
They were grandfathered in.
Yeah. And then that gave them time, and it was only a matter of probably a couple of 2 or 3 or 4 meetings after that for them to adopt regulations that would govern taxi cabs and card rooms, improve their functioning and upgrading their functions.
So it sounded like you guys were pretty busy back then. I wouldn't imagine that you had to put a lot in place. You were probably working pretty long hours as
I counted recently, going through the minutes, 46 council meetings that first year.
Wow. But that's about one a week.
Mm-hmm.
We have them twice a month. Wow, you were busy back then. So, and I would imagine that the council at that time probably didn't have a lot of experience in local government, so you probably had to spend a lot of time directing what needed to be done.
Yes, I guess you could say I functioned as their city administrator as well as a city attorney, because they had no staff except for Ella Gates, who volunteered her time and worked diligently as the city clerk for a good 1.5 years after incorporation.
Wow, well, that's, I'm very thankful, I'm sure many other people are too. So on their behalf, I'd like to thank you for all the early work that all of you did back then, because it certainly sounds like it took a lot of time and effort on a lot of people's parts. So I have some other questions too about after incorporation. I heard that there was there a lawsuit against the incorporation?
Yes, there was a challenge to the incorporation, to the validity of the incorporation after we had been declared a city. And my recollection is that it was initiated by interests who were concerned that the new city was going to impose stricter regulations on taxi cabs and card rooms and beer bars.
So they actually went and filed a lawsuit. That was probably the first town lawsuit.
Yes, it was filed in the Superior Court in Napa, and Judge Ray Sherwin from Solano County was appointed to hear the lawsuit, and resulted in a favorable judgment for the city, justifying and upholding the incorporation.
Wow, that's good. That just getting started, you almost had a short ending there, but I'm glad that was successful. What can you tell us a little bit about, right now we just had an election, and we just re-elected 2 of our incumbents on the city council, but we also elected our mayor. That's a separate election that we hold in addition to electing the council members. Was it always that way?
No. In a general law city, which was what Yountville was, the people elect the mayor and five council members. And the 5 council members themselves elect a mayor. And typically the practice is to elect a mayor for 1 year on a rotating basis, so that all 5 members of the town council have an opportunity to serve as mayor. And that has been the practice in all of the cities that I've represented over the years. But cities do have the option of asking the voters to approve a separately elected mayor. And in 1984, I believe it was, the town approved a ballot proposition which provided for a separately elected a mayor for a 2-year term. Prior to that, and while I was the city attorney, town attorney, the office of mayor was rotated among the 5 individual members of the council. And the original council consisted of 3 members from the home and 2 members from the town at large. And so every member had an opportunity to serve as mayor. Subsequently, they had an election in 1966 that resulted in a 3rd member from the town being elected to the town council, reducing the number of council members from the home to 2.
I see. And was that when Thurman was elected?
Yes, that's correct.
Okay.
When Thurman Gates was elected to the council.
So the person with the highest votes, were they typically the first mayor? Is that why he's...
Yes, and it was Dr. Clarence Johnson who was the first elected. No, I take that back. It was O.O. Capito, who was, I think, the chief accountant or finance officer at the home. I don't recall his exact title.
Okay, so he was
But
on,
he was
on the first council then.
Because he got the highest number of votes.
The very first time. Okay, great. Let's see what else I wanted to talk about. Let's talk a little bit about, I've heard that the city limits have changed at least once after the initial incorporation, or twice. Do you have, what can you tell us about that?
While I was a city attorney, we had 2 annexations. One was a strictly technical one, that the original description of the county water district boundaries had excluded a small parcel of property. So we had to annex that in order to the consolidation of the water functions as a part of the city functions.
And I think that's up now near what we call R&D Kitchen, near the north end of town, or around the Burgundy Commons area, if I recall looking at the map correctly. So that was just a very small piece of property.
Yes, it was strictly technical.
Okay.
So there was no controversy about it. The second annexation was to bring in the property known as the marketplace.
The marketplace. And it was my understanding that the reason they left it out the first time because it contained grapevines, and the county asked them not to incorporate anything that was agricultural land. So at that time, I think it was Ray Monty who helped strongly petition both the city and the state.
Yes, Ray on behalf of the ownership of that property petitioned this town council for annexation.
So was that a fairly straightforward procedure back then?
Yes, very, very routine.
Okay.
It was unopposed, non-controversial.
That's always good. I always like non-controversial items. So What other, do you have any other information that, just in general, that you'd like to share about your time and your activities then?
Well, yes, there are a couple of other things. In particular, in the financial area, when a city incorporates, it becomes eligible to receive state subventions. Those are gas tax monies and various other forms of
Probably property tax?
grants to, not real property taxes.
Okay.
The city and the county share
I see.
the real property tax and the sales taxes. But gas tax subventions, for example, street and highway functions, subventions, are granted to cities on a population basis. When Yountville incorporated, it was between decennial census, previous
At
census.
65, then we have our census
Yes.
at the beginning of each decade.
So in real terms, the population of Yountville was in the 300 to 500 area.
Not, so that would
This
not be...
includes the veterans home.
Okay.
And if they had the number of subventions, the calculation for subvention. At the time of incorporation, there were roughly 350 registered voters in the town.
Proper, as we would call it, on
Yes.
the east side of Highway 29. Do you happen to know how many were residing up at the Veterans Home at that time?
I don't recall the number of registered voters at that time.
Significantly more, though, I believe, then.
Yes. I think in the neighborhood of 1,200.
Yeah.
So we're talking closely, in terms of registered voters, 1,900.
Total.
Subventions were calculated roughly at that time at about $7.50 per registered voter. So that meant money would be coming from the state based upon $7.50 times 1,900, or subventions in the neighborhood of about $14,000 a year.
So that's what helped finance the city government at the time, then?
Well, that's based upon the population calculated in 1960 terms.
I see.
But state law provided that when a city incorporated, they would use, and they didn't have the current census. So we're talking about 1,900 registered voters within the town limits, including the veterans home. Multiplying that by $7.50, that's about $14,000 per annum coming back to the town in terms of state subventions. But because of the anomaly of incorporating in between decennial censuses, the state law said you would take the number of registered voters and multiply it by 3. That gave the city a fictitious population of 5,700.
That's very impressive.
And you multiply that by $7.50, and you get something in the neighborhood of $43,000 a year in subventions coming back to the city.
We do owe a lot to our residents at Yountville's Veterans Home, don't we? I hope that's a very, very important piece of information that we're very gracious
Indeed.
for the members. Well, that is very interesting. Well, that certainly helps get the government going and operating at that time. That's great. Was there anything else you wanted to add? I have one final question for you.
Well, yes. At the time I was the town attorney here, I was also the town attorney, the city attorney of Pleasant Hill. And in 1968, the city of Benicia asked me to become their city attorney. And I accepted. And the city of Benicia and the city of Yountville had their council meetings on the same night. And after about trying to juggle that for 3 or 4 months, I decided it just wasn't working for either city or for me. And so I submitted my resignation after having served about 3 years and 9 months as the town attorney of Yountville.
Well, thank you for your service, especially at that very seminal part of our beginnings. I think that we certainly appreciate everything that you did to get us going and get us through that first lawsuit, and to keep us incorporated now. In just a few months, it'll be for 50 years. So now that we're talking about 50 years, so now that you've come back to Yountville today to do this video, you talked about all the card rooms and the bars and the dilapidated houses 50 years ago. We'd love to hear your comments on Yountville today.
Well, in my career, I was the first city attorney of not only Pleasant Hill, but Lafayette, Orinda, Moraga, and Danville. I've been the city attorney of Benicia, the city attorney of Pittsburgh, and represented other cities on a contractual basis on special matters. And coming back to Yountville, after 50 years, it is the crown jewel of all of the cities that I've represented over the years. I am so proud to have been associated with the city, and how would I put it? Treasure my connection with the city.
Well, we certainly appreciate everything you did back then, and that's one of the main reasons I wanted to make these documents of that time, so that everybody else who's with us today or maybe in the future can really see exactly what it took to take us from where we were back in the 60s to where we are today. So again, thank you very much.
It was a great pleasure, Marjorie. Thank you for the opportunity.